vem pra cá, vem pra cá. Esse é um workshop que está dentro do escopo da disciplina, que a gente tem regular aqui, uma vez por ano, do Departamento de Engenharia Elétrica, do programa de pós-graduação, chama Economia da Energia. A gente tenta, ao longo dessa disciplina, trazer 1 ou 2 workshops de pessoas externas para tentar mostrar para vocês um pouco sobre a prática daquilo que é aprendido dentro da sala de aula. A gente já contou com um workshop do Luiz Barroso no ano passado, e a gente só conseguiu trazer o Francisco agora, por conta do final do ano, mas ainda está dentro do escopo do pessoal que fez 2018, segundo semestre. Bom, nessa disciplina a gente cobriu vários aspectos interessantes e basicamente mostrou como os conceitos econômicos são transportados para o desenho, a operação e de alguma maneira para criar alocações de recursos que são escassos dentro do contexto energético. A gente viu várias coisas ao longo da disciplina, como o desenho de um mercado depende intrinsecamente do tipo de sistema e dos tipos de recurso e a sua escassez. Seja em granularidade temporal, seja em termos tecnológicos, isso tudo vai impactar muito na maneira com que a gente faz o desenho ao mercado. Tá? O Francisco vai mostrar para vocês hoje uma parte bem interessante que não foi coberta integralmente no curso, justamente por ter a parte dele aqui, que é de como se desenha o mercado em função do que se quer mostrar. Então ele vai mostrar para a gente uma toolbox de ferramentas e de maneira de abordar um problema, tá? Em que se constrói mercados dentro do framework matemático que a gente vai usar, e ali a gente pode testar. Se eu botar uma taxa para carbono, se eu fizer agora um outro mercado conjunto com contratos, como é que isso se modela num ambiente de mercado, onde a gente não tem mais as coisas todas centralizadas? Tá? Então esse é o objetivo, é mostrar uma nova ferramenta para um escopo diferente do que a gente está acostumado aqui no Brasil. A gente já tem utilizado um pouco disso no longo prazo, para a parte dos leilões de contrato, mas para a parte de mais curto prazo isso é uma novidade. Saber simular, saber usar, saber testar é a maneira com que você pode ver se uma coisa vai dar certo e, portanto, controlar os outcomes que podem sair dali. Então, eu enxergo essa metodologia, esse framework que ele vai trazer para a gente como estratégico, porque a gente está querendo cada vez mais olhar para um ambiente de mercado. Se fala muito que o mercado é a solução, e vocês vão ver que o mercado não é a solução para tudo. Ele é uma maneira, uma alternativa, que tem prós e contras. Tá? E no momento em que você desenha o mercado, você ainda tem uma pergunta, que é qual é o tipo de mercado. Não existe um sistema elétrico no mundo que tenha um mercado igual ao outro. O mercado ele é desenhado para aquele sistema, para aquelas características, e ele está em constante evolução. Então isso é um pouco do que o Francisco vai trazer para a gente. O Francisco ele estudou com o Ben Hobbs, que é um super nome em desenho de mercado, em outras áreas também. E eu vou deixar então agora a palavra com ele e a gente vai até às 5. A gente vai ter um coffee break no meio, mais ou menos 3h30 a gente para, lá fora vai ter um coffee break, e aí a gente vai ficar 15 minutinhos e volta para cá, ok?
Thank you very much. I was told that you never start the presentation with an apology, but I want to apologize because I don't speak Portuguese. I know that many of you understand Spanish and speak a little bit, but I don't speak a single word of Portuguese, so I'm sorry. So presentation will be in English. All right, so a little bit of context for this. I don't know if you already said it. Actually, I didn't understand what you were saying. This started actually as one of our projects. Like we wanted to work together, and we've been trying to do this for a while. It wasn't working, and at one point I told Alexandre, "Hey, how about I visit you in Rio with my girlfriend, and I can meet with your students. We can see what we can do together." And then that evolved into, "Hey, how about you teach a tutorial on markets? Yeah, that'll be fun. We'll have like 3-4 students. That'll be very entertaining. How about we invite more people?" And then, I'm really happy that you're all interested in this topic, so thank you very much for coming. So, so the title of this workshop is, it's basically an introduction to market design and equilibrium modeling in electricity markets. We have 2 days. Today I'm going to give you more context. I'm going to explain some generalities, give some definitions, and tomorrow I'm going to show you three specific applications. Okay, so the goals of this workshop are to basically highlight why optimization and economics or markets are two sides of the same thing, basically. It's the same thing, okay? I want to convey the importance of market design, particularly in the electricity market, and I just want to give you a toolbox on how you can approach your questions about market design. I'm not going to give you answers necessarily here. I'm just going to tell you where to look for answers and what are the tools that you can use to answer those questions you have. Okay. So we're going to talk about Nash equilibrium, mixed complementarity modeling, risk aversion, and financial markets, which are very important in the electricity markets. How to model administrative rules or price controls, and then we're going to talk about strategic behavior as a multi-level game. That's tomorrow. Okay, so today we're going to talk about basically what's common between optimization of markets, and then we're going to talk about Nash equilibrium. Okay. So since last year I'm teaching a graduate course in the operational research program at my university. It's the director of the department asked me, can you teach a microeconomics class for operational research? I said, sure. And I realized that it would be a bad idea to just take a standard microeconomic class and just teach that, because these are people that think as optimizers, you know. So I found that actually many famous economists have a background in operational research. Alvin Roth is one of them. And if you Google a little bit of economics, you'll find that there are many people that started as optimizers and then eventually evolved into economists. And this is one that won the Nobel Prize on market design. Okay, so officially I'm a mechanical engineer. That's my background. And as a graduate student, I started learning more and more about economics. I think that's a strength because I've seen these problems from two different sides. So how do optimizers see things? What is optimization? I showed this to my student. What if I Google optimization? It says that optimization is just the action to making the best of most efficient use of a situation of resource, right? And that's kind of like the standard way how we approach an optimization problem. We have some decision variables, an objective function subject to some restrictions, right? That's what we think of when we say optimization. In microeconomics, if you Google microeconomics and look up for the definition, it says that it's a social science, very important, that studies how individuals use or manage scarce resources to satisfy their needs. And what I realized is that if you look at that sentence and start tearing it off, you're going to find that there are many connections of this with this previous definition. It's almost the same thing. So individuals, basically you have decision makers, someone that wants to accomplish something. It's plural, there are many. They want to use or manage. That means that they have decision variables, they want to do something. Their resources are scarce, they can't do whatever they want, right? You have a fixed salary and that's all you have, you can't spend more than that. Unless you ask for a loan, but and you want to satisfy your needs, right? That you have some objective function. So when I read that, to me, this is the same thing, right? What's the difference? That here we have many agents, right? So instead of having one optimization problem in economics, we think as many optimization problems. We have many individuals making choices. And these individuals are often assumed to be rational. In mathematical terms, rationality means that they optimize their decision, that they always solve that optimization problem, and they're not done until they find the very best solution, right? They're not okay with a 5% optimality gap, 0% optimality gap. That means rationality, right? So these agents are interacting, and what makes this a market, like introducing a new word here, is that they might be buying or selling goods, and they interact in the market, and there is a constraint that balances the market. Basically, what people sell has to adapt to what people buy, basically, right? You can't create new products out of nowhere or make products disappear, right? Everything has to be preserved. That's a market. Yeah, that's a market in optimization words. Okay, central planning versus markets. I'm gonna go back to the first slide. Here I had, one single optimization problem. Here we have multiple optimization problems. So given a resource allocation problem that involves many individuals, the question is, how can we solve that problem? Okay. So for example, like how much how much food should we get every month, for example? Okay. One option is to just use a central planner, okay, that solves a single optimization problem considering the variables, constraints, and preferences of all agents. So basically that planner maximizes the sum of all the preferences of the individuals, meeting all the constraints, subject to this market clearing constraint. This is just a balance constraint, okay? So here basically the central planner makes decisions on behalf of the agent. The central planner knows better, knows how to do everything, okay? And there is no need to compute prices here to solve the problem, because you don't need prices to coordinate anything. It's just the central planner is like an authority that's going to say, you get this much food, you get this much food, that's it. Okay. But this might be a challenge. Why do you, maybe there's someone that could tell me why this might be really hard to solve. Anyone? There are big computers today, so solving the argument of the problem is too big. Sure, maybe in the 60s. Today you can pay for Amazon Web Services and you can solve a very big problem. But that's not the problem, right? What's the actual problem to solve that?
How to balance the food distribution?
Okay.
How to balance the food distribution among the individuals?
Okay. Another.
How to know the preferences of each individual?
So the biggest problem here is not computation. It's not that I don't have a big computer. If you go back to the classic papers on the debates between central planning and markets, you're going to read that one of the first arguments that academics gave was, this is a problem that's too big. It's not possible to solve this problem. It's too big. But maybe that was a point back then. Today, I don't believe that much into that, okay? But the real problem is that all of these things are private information. The preferences of all the agents are not necessarily observable. Preferences and constraints. So in the moment you write this, you're pretending that you actually know the preferences of agent 1, agent 2, agent 3, agent 4. And the problem is that preferences might be a little bit more complicated than that and maximizing profit.
What if you have the reverse problem that an individual cannot observe decisions x2, xn, but that decisions impacts their life, such as how many people drive, and if everybody's driving, then it will take much more time to go.
Those are called externalities, right?
Right, but they are not represented in either formulation.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I want to talk a little bit about that too. So, just the main message of this is that you can do this as long as you believe that, as long as you have access to good information on this. Otherwise, you're doing optimization on something that you're not even sure that if it's right. There's a term, an expression in English that says garbage in, garbage out. It doesn't matter if you give me the optimal solution of a problem that is wrong, right? So that's the main challenge of central planning, basically. But if you have access to very good information, it's really hard to beat that. Yeah, and I was talking about preferences. Preferences might be something very complicated. Preference could, I don't know, agents could be risk averse. So maybe you know that someone is risk averse, but you don't know how risk averse, for example. And the problem is that if you go and ask that agent, hey, tell me your preferences, you don't know if that agent's gonna tell you the truth. You might have incentives to lie to you. Okay? Say I ask you, how much food do you want? I want a lot of food. Maybe you don't need a lot of food. Maybe you need a little less. You actually want less, but you believe that by lying to me, you're going to be insuring yourself against something. Okay? So the problem is that if the central planner goes and asks the agent about their preferences, their objective function, there's no way to guarantee that they will tell the truth. So it's an information extraction problem. Yeah. So we're talking about a different dimension here. That's the biggest problem. Okay? Another way to solve this is to implement a market and to just let agents trade. Okay? If each agent solved its own optimization problem, they might only need prices to coordinate. Okay? This agent doesn't need to know what's the objective function and the constraint of the next agent. There's no need for it. Just give me a price and I'll decide how much I want to buy or sell, and that's it. If the price is high, I don't need to know what's going on in the market. Why it's high? It's high. That's it. Yeah. So that's a market. Okay, that's the other way to solve. So, if you're taking any microeconomics class, and there are very, very long set of assumptions, perfect competition, perfect information, infinite players, etc., etc. Turns out that a market and a central planner can achieve the same allocation of resources. There are two famous theorems. These are the welfare theorems. And the only thing they say is that one thing implies the other one. The first theorem of welfare economics says that any competitive equilibrium leads to a Pareto efficient outcome. Basically, any equilibrium of this problem is an optimal solution of this problem. That's the direction of the implication. Okay? That's the first welfare theorem. And this is the famous invisible hand, if you have heard of it, from Adam Smith. The invisible hand will lead to an efficient market. That's the first theorem of welfare economics. And the second theorem of welfare economics is the opposite. It's the other way. It says, if you find an optimal solution to some central problem, and under a very long set of assumptions, you can always implement that same solution as a market. The other way. Okay? That's not the invisible hand. It says, if you know what's the goal that you can achieve as a central planner, there is always a set of prices that will achieve that same goal. The other way. Okay? The problem is that this works very well in only certain markets. Do you know which markets the assumptions are reasonable? I didn't list them here, but any intuition on which markets look like textbook markets, like almost perfect? There are no perfect markets in the world, but some of them are very close to perfect.
North Pole.
Which one?
North Pole. North Pole, Scandinavia.
Scandinavia.
Yeah.
Outside of electricity markets, any market. Wall Street.
No.
Oh. Yeah. Commodity markets. Yeah, I would say commodity markets are pretty close to textbook definition of how markets should be a good market. Okay? But the problem is that many of the other markets do not hold that. And then these theorems don't apply. Okay? One thing doesn't imply the other. And that's when we're in trouble. Okay? So I'm going to show you a couple examples of what happens when things go bad. So for example, central planning. this is a good example of what happens when central planning doesn't work very well. These are Mao's 5-year plans from the Republic of China from the 1900s. So the first plan, he proposed advances in agriculture, coal, electric industry, and steel production. It was all central planning in the market. That worked mildly well. But in the second plan, there was an oops. They did some bad planning with food. They also had some bad luck. They had some natural disasters. And as a result of that bad planning, 15 million people died due to a lack of food. Okay, so it's tricky. What happens if the central planner does something bad? People can even die. Okay. Another example of poor central planning. A student pointed out this to me. In China, many cities are planned. I'm in favor of urban planning. Coordinating where the park should be. I'm totally okay with that. But in China, they take that to the next level. Let's build an entire city before people even show up. Okay? Let's just build the entire city and people will come. And there are cities that have been built like that, but when people have not shown up yet, and the cities are empty, and they have been empty for years. I understand that Brasilia was planned here, but there are a lot of people living in Brasilia, so I wouldn't call that a failure. But here, so the failure is not planning the city. The failure is that you built a city and no one wants to live there. That's a problem. Okay. Well, and then you will say, well, the markets are better. Not necessarily. Okay. Climate change has been called the biggest market failure ever. Okay. They estimate that the economic losses due to climate change are approximately around $20 to $40 trillion. So that's a big number. Just so you have a reference, the global GDP is around 2016 was about 80 trillion. So climate change might wipe out 50% of the global GDP, and that's because we haven't considered the externalities. That's a market failure. Okay.
So you mean this number, $20 to $40 trillion per year?
No, that was.
Is this accumulated over the past?
It's like a snapshot. You take a snapshot of what's the value of everything that is on Earth. That's the number. That was the number in 2016. It's not per year. It's just they took that picture in 2016 because GDP changes over time, but they measure it in 2016. It's a snapshot. Okay. Now it must be higher. Another market failure, the Superprime Crisis. We're still feeling some of the consequences of that, right? That was due to poor lending practices by banks in South America, okay? Economic losses approximately between 6 to 25 trillion. Economists have not agreed yet where to start or stopping measuring the losses, okay? So it seems that they can be both good and bad, okay? I show you this because sometimes when I talk to people about central planning or markets, some people get very religious about this. Some people say, no, markets are the best thing. No, central planning is the best. And I think that has a lot to do with political views too, okay? Here, we're completely away from that. Here we're looking at markets just as a tool to achieve something, and central planning. We don't follow any sort of philosophy or anything, okay? And I just want to show you that both tools can be bad sometimes, okay? Okay, so what's for us to do? Turns out that many of the best markets in the world, the most efficient ones, use a combination of central planning and markets. A little bit of both, okay? And I think this is a very good example, Uber, okay? Uber uses a market, or markets, as decentralized decision, letting passengers and drivers participate in this application voluntarily. Uber posts prices, and drivers show up, and passengers show up, and that's it. Okay, that's a market. Uber is not obligating anyone. If the driver comes and you don't like the car, you can cancel it. Maybe you have to pay a little bit, but it's not forbidden. You can just walk away. If you call it and then suddenly a cab shows up, a taxi, you can cancel it too, and no problem. Okay? If you believe that you can get a car faster than through Uber, don't use Uber. It's voluntary. Okay? It's a market. No one's forcing anyone. If you're a driver and you're sleepy, you can just close the application and go home. No problem. Okay? But there's a centralized part, and that's where Uber makes money. That's the service of Uber. Okay? Takes the demand and takes the supply and crosses those curves. Okay? That's a centralized part. Okay? So Uber suggests matches between passenger and drivers, suggests a route to the destination. The driver doesn't have to follow it necessarily. You can follow something different. And Uber is responsible for balancing supply and demand. Okay? If there are too many passengers, not enough drivers, and prices don't change, passengers start getting angry. Start saying, oh, this application is crap. You know, I'm not getting a drive. And the other way around is the same. Maybe there are too many drivers and they're not getting passengers, they're not making money, they're just burning fuel. You're gonna say, oh, I don't like this application, I'm just gonna go do something else. This is not worth my time. Well, Uber tries to balance that using a parameter, and that parameter is the price. The price in Uber doesn't emerge from the interaction of agents, doesn't emerge from a negotiation between agents, it emerges from a central planner that proposes a price, knowing the constraints, knowing what's the layout of the city, and proposes prices that match supply and demand. That's the value of Uber. Very recently at the Operational Research Conference in the US, Informs, we had a plenary speaker that was one of the heads of Uber. And it was incredible what are the things that they were doing there. They're not actually just trying to match supply and demand. They're doing things that look very much like what system operators are doing in the electricity market. They're trying to forecast demand. And he gave an example. He said, take for example, you know, a typical American, a typical city in the US. Many of them have big stadiums kind of like outside of the city, in the outskirts. Big concerts are there. And the problem is that close to those places, there are not enough houses. And the problem is that you have a peak in demand right when the concert is done. But there is no reason for drivers to be driving around that area because there are no passengers to pick. So what Uber tries to do is they try to set up incentives for drivers to get close to that area before the concert is done. So that way, when people get out of the concert, there is demand peak. There are enough drivers there, and Uber gives them incentives. It sounds a lot like an ISO, except that Uber is making money. Okay, they are the system operator is not for profit. Okay, so turns out that many existing markets in the world were designed. They did not emerge like spontaneously. Many of the markets people talk about in economic courses are like standard markets, like the market for potatoes. Someone one day had too many potatoes at home and someone wanted potatoes and there was a trade. And then they realized that they didn't need to barter, like exchange potatoes for tomatoes. They could use like a fiat device, like a money, for example. Those are the markets that most of the economic studies focus on, okay? But many of the modern markets did not emerge like that. And because many of the modern markets have a lot of engineering constraints, okay? And for those markets, like the standard theory of economics doesn't work very well. Anytime you have discontinuities anytime you have a market that collapses if supply doesn't match demand, electricity market, for example. So modern electricity market, peer-to-peer online markets, dating platform, Tinder, school assignment programs. I'm going to talk a little bit about the National Resident Matching Program. Some of these were central planning applications initially. They did not work very well, and they realized that they could like dualize it and turn it into a market, and now it's working fine. Markets for kidney exchange too. So if you think about this, all of these are assignment problems. There are people that want something, people that are offering something, and you just like need to just match them, okay? And you can do that in a centralized fashion or in a market fashion. And here, I'm just telling you that you can combine those things and offer a very good solution. Okay, so what's an example of a complex engineering constraint? If you look at the standard model of a market, in my initial slides, there was a constraint that said the sum of X has to be equal to 0. So supply has to be equal to demand. In many cases, in many markets, sometimes supply doesn't exactly equal demand, but the market doesn't collapse. So for example, if you go to, I don't know, to buy tomatoes in one place, like early in the morning, in your local market, and you get there too late, they're not tomatoes. Supply doesn't match demand. You want tomatoes, but there are not enough tomatoes. Well, what happened? You're sad. You go to the supermarket and maybe pay more for the tomatoes, or you don't have tomatoes. You eat something else. But the market doesn't collapse. Okay? But there are markets that if supply doesn't match demand, there's no market. Okay? And one example is the electricity market. We need to keep a frequency, because most of our devices, or all of our devices, were designed to operate for a given frequency. And if you get out of there, what's a maximum deviation here, people from the operator?
0.1.
0.1, what's that, a percentage?
Yeah. The frequency is 60, and it can vary more or less 0.5 up and down. Okay.
And if you get outside of that range, the system might collapse.
No, the system gets some
Unstable?
unstable.
Okay. Okay. So bad things will happen. Basically you can get out of that range, and then everything might go wrong. Okay? They're like this externalities. So in those markets, you can't just let people maybe trade and figure what they want to buy on their own. Someone needs to be keeping this in check. That's the role of the system operator. Okay? Here's another example. This is a map of the United States in 2016, and all those little dots there are flights, commercial flights. Okay? At the same time. Okay, this is like a snapshot in 1 second. So you can think of what will happen if we will let airplanes or flights coordinate the airspace on their own. Let's create a market for airspace, and they'll figure out what to do. The price will clear the market for space. What could go wrong? We don't need control towers. They will figure it out on their own. Right? That's an assignment problem where you probably wouldn't suggest a market. Okay? Things like that, right? Well, it turns out that there's a little bit of a market sometimes. I remember I was flying back from Europe to the US, and we were about to land in Atlanta, and the flight kept like going around and around the city. We're like, wait, what's going on? Where are we landing? Turned out that we departed late from Europe, so we were late for our spot to land in Atlanta. And suddenly the pilot said, hey, I'm sorry guys, we're late, but I'm going to put in a bid so we can land soon. And I was like, a bid? What are you talking about? Well, it turned out that in some airports, if you are sort of like out of merit, you're too far back in the queue for landing, you can place a bid and take the position of someone ahead of you, as long as that other flight is willing to accept your bid. Okay? It could make sense if you think about it, because many flights, say you have passengers that have connecting flights that are international, you're going to have to compensate those passengers. So for you, every minute that you're delayed costs you more money. So maybe you're just willing to pay another airline to let you land before. Okay? So they use a combination of market and central planning. More central planning than market. Okay? So what is market design? Okay, so I'm going to just read that definition. Market design is a branch of economics that takes an engineering approach to fix or design markets. Okay? A professor once told me this analogy. He said, look, if you need to build a bridge, you wouldn't call a physicist. You know that physicists know a lot about physics and how bodies interact, but you need an engineer. Market design kind of emerges like the equivalent of engineering economics, something like that. These are folks that don't just focus on the theory, but also focus on all other aspects of markets to make them work. Because the theory, the economic theory, doesn't explain how agents get to the equilibrium. It just says, there's an equilibrium. How the agents get there? No idea. You just get there somehow. Market design tries to help agents to get to that efficient equilibrium. So market design tries to fix the design market, recognizing that well-functioning markets depend on detailed rules. So market designers sort of like set up communication protocols for the agents to talk to each other. Okay? Market designers rely on all of those tools. Non-cooperative game theory, we're going to talk a lot about that. Cooperative game theory, we're not going to talk about that. Mechanism design, I'm going to give you an example of that. That's very cool, very cool. Auction theory, operational research, and mathematical programming. You're going to see that many of the folks that work in market design have a background in operations research, actually. Engineering, psychology, and public policy. Okay, it's not just economics. It mixes up a lot of different branches. So here's a simple example. So what's the difference between optimization and market design? So here goes the example. There's a mother that wants to divide a cake between her daughters. And they want to make sure that they are both happy. What's the challenge? That the daughters have different preferences. Those preferences are private, okay? And they will lie if they have. If you just ask them like what they want, they will just lie, okay? And the problem is that here getting a better piece of cake is not simple. It's not just getting a larger piece of cake. If the cake is asymmetric, has different flavors, it's not obvious what better means. Better is like a private thing, okay? Maybe one daughter wants a larger piece of the Pikachu there, something like that, okay? So an optimization approach to solve this problem, like a central planner. The mom just hits the table and says, I'm tired of you. I'm just gonna go and cut the cake based on some rule. I'm just gonna split it right in the middle. And here you have, I don't care if you don't like it. That's it. That's the optimization approach to solve the problem. Maybe the daughters will be happy, maybe not. It's very likely that the man will fail. An approach that follows mechanism design is, why don't we let the daughters figure out how they can solve this problem? So what's the job of the mom? Just to set up a protocol so the daughters can figure this problem out on their own. And here's an option. The mom gives the knife to one of the daughters first and tells her, why don't you cut the cake first, but your sister is gonna pick the first piece of cake. Very elegant solution. So then the daughter that cuts the cake first has to be very careful where she cuts it, because she knows if she cuts one piece too much larger than the other one, her sister is going to pick maybe the larger piece. But she has to be very careful. She has to maybe make an assumption of what's that her sister wants and what that she wants, and maybe she's going to try to cut the cake in some smart way. But they solved the problem. It wasn't the mom. Okay? But that's more like a market approach to solve this assignment problem. Okay? That was a simple example. Here's a more advanced application. What was the problem? To place the medical students in the US to residency training programs in US hospitals. Students want to go to the best hospitals, the most prestigious one, and maybe they want to live in really nice cities. There's a lot of cities that are not very nice in the US, places where you don't really want to live, and there are other very nice places to live. And same thing with hospitals. They want to attract the best and most talented students. Okay? It's an assignment problem. Yeah? So the initial design was a decentralized market. Everyone on their own. So hospitals will just compete for students. They will just send offers. And the problem is that they realized that the best students will get many offers. So what the hospitals did was like, hey, how about we make an offer earlier than the other hospitals? That way we ensure that we get like good students. So the hospitals started competing not on offers, but on how early the offer was made. Okay? So it was very stressful because it was really hard for the student to commit to something so early on in the program. They got to make offers in second year of medical school. So the student had just passed maybe anatomy, and then they would just receive an offer from a hospital, like to do a residency program in, say, some brain surgery, you know? And maybe they liked anatomy, but then in a practical course later on, they realized that they hated blood and they could not work with, like, you know, a real patient. So it was very stressful, and it was hard for hospitals to know which were the good students. They were just making bets. So the outcome of that was lots of stress and bad matches. Okay, it's not that there were not matches, just a lot of people were frustrated. And same thing with hospitals. So the later design involved a centralized market. And it's important here that the second word there is market, it's not planner, market. Okay, it's a centralized market. It's like they created a coordinator, okay? A system operator, if you wish. So they say, okay, how about this? We create a centralized clearinghouse that will coordinate the matches. Hospitals will send offers to this central clearinghouse. They will describe the candidates they were looking for. Maybe they will rank the candidates in terms of preferences. And the students will also submit their ranked preference. They will say, my first option is to go to this hospital, my second option is this one, etc., etc. The participation was voluntary. No one was forced to do this. If you wanted to negotiate, doing bilateral negotiation with the hospitals, up to you. The problem with this is at first they were not sure if there were incentives to reveal the true preferences. Because as I said before, what's the point of central planning if you're optimizing over crappy data? Like if people are lying, you're optimizing over a lie. You're finding an optimal solution to a problem that doesn't exist, basically. Okay? So that was the first problem. And these two guys realized that there was one algorithm that's called the Deferred acceptance algorithm to match hospitals or students to hospitals that give stable matches and that incentivize students to reveal the true preferences. Basically, they prove, there's a theorem that shows that if a student lies, if a student tries to pretend that they have a different set of preferences, they will always be worse off than revealing the true preferences. So you're not, they explain that to the doctors today. They say, let me explain this to you. If you try to lie, you're going to be bad. Like, don't do it. Maybe just tell me the truth. Trust me. Stable matches, that's sort of the analogy of equilibrium. Basically, whatever the software of the platform assigned to me, there's no way for me to find another hospital that will want me and I will want the hospital too. No possibility. Okay, maybe I wanted to go, say, to, I don't know, the hospital of Johns Hopkins University. But maybe Johns Hopkins University didn't want me. So that's not necessarily a match. We have to want each other. That's a match. Okay? So they got a little prize for that, a Nobel Prize, for their work in market design matching theory. They also help in other things. But that's sort of like an example of how you can turn this decentralized problem into a centralized problem, still using markets. Okay? And using mechanism design theory and optimization. There's a lot of optimization here. Okay? There's a, if you wish, an economic dispatch problem here. Same thing. Okay, empirical evidence. Are people happy with this or not? So these are different markets for medical residences. Some of these follow, use the deferred acceptance algorithm, the one that is stable. Some of them still don't use it. And these ones are still in use. So you can see that there's some correlation between the markets that have some interesting property, like stability, and assignment algorithms that have no, basically, economic property behind it. Okay? A couple of them are not stable, but they're still used. We don't know if maybe two more years they're still going to use it. But what I'm trying to say is that people and hospitals are happy with the results that this platform is giving them. They're not trying to change it because it's working. Okay, so if you want to learn more about market design in general, not electricity market design necessarily, I highly recommend you to go over this. By the way, I was asked to tell you that these slides are going to be available, so you can download it and see it. By the way, this book is Who Gets What and Why. My students have to read it in my microeconomics course. So in the course, I go all over the math on this, and the book describes all of these matching markets in words. Like anyone can read it. It's really interesting. They also design a market for kidneys, for kidney change. So what's the problem with those markets? You cannot use money. Like you're not allowed to use money. You cannot buy a kidney. Okay, so it's a constraint on market design. Give me an algorithm where you assign things, but you cannot use money. Things like that. It's really cool. And here are some introductory papers, okay, to look for this. Even if you're working in electricity markets, it's really good to learn about the other markets, and you're going to realize that these system operators and stuff appear all over the place. It's not just electricity markets. A lot of times, people pretend that the problem they're having in electricity markets, this is just our market. All the other markets are different. Sure, but let me tell you, there are many other markets that share very similar problems, and we can learn from there too. So try to explore away from the electricity markets too. Okay, so market design in electricity markets. Is market design relevant for electricity markets? Yes, extremely relevant. Okay. I found this definition in a recent report from the European Commission. This report, it's supposed to be for everyone to read it, so they try to give a very simple definition of what market design is. So they say, new electricity market design, a fair deal for consumers. So they say, market design is the rule book for energy market players. And my favorite phrase here is, market design is the software on which our energy markets run, while the energy infrastructure is the hardware. So a lot of people think a lot about hardware, let's improve our solar panels, let's improve our machines, but they're going to run on something, on a market, on a software. And if you can have excellent machines, but if your software is crappy, they can't work well. Okay? So that's a very good definition of market design. So, some examples of market design questions in electricity markets. One of the earliest questions: can markets provide efficient generation portfolios? Markets started existing since the 80s, actually. In Chile, we implemented the first deregulated market, at least in generation, okay? So this is a brief history of markets, electricity markets. It all started as public monopolies. What was the problem? Poor incentives for innovation, pass-through of all costs. Basically, if the government made a mistake, consumers would just pay for it, whatever. And this was a big problem. A government could manipulate the public enterprises to follow political agendas. So that was, people didn't like that a lot. So then the next option was like, well, what if we take this away from the government, but we keep it as a monopoly? So a private regulated monopoly. And then the problem was that, okay, how we regulate this monopoly? Because now that firm really knows its cost structure, we don't, but we need to tell them how much they can charge. How we do this? So there's an information asymmetry between the firm and the regulator. Basically, very soon, the economists realized that it was virtually impossible to come up with a mechanism so that the monopolists would tell the truth. Almost impossible. So some of the first designs were, for example, rate of return regulation. So you provide electricity to consumers, and I give you a 10% rate of return over your capital every year, for example. So at the end of the year, you give me all your receipts for all your expenses, and we multiply that by 1.10, and then you spread that all over your customers, and you get your 10% rate of return. The problem is that gives incentive to the monopolist to just maximize cost, because if I get a 10% return over what I spend, well, then I just spend more, right? It's called the average Johnson effect. Okay, and in the regulated, and so this eventually became deregulated. It all started in Chile. Many countries followed. There were costly mistakes at the beginning. California, the California market, that's the best example. But that's a good example to learn from, because they made many mistakes there. They basically deregulated the market, but they didn't listen much to what the economists were saying. So for example, the governor of California discouraged firms from signing contracts, long-term contracts. Say, no, they'll sign contracts. The spot market is going to be way better for you. Well, surprise! If there's no long-term position and you're making all the money in the spot market, you have all the incentives to raise your prices way to the sky, you know, and there's no one to prevent you from doing that. That's exactly what happened. Okay, but markets today are working pretty well, and that has a lot to do with contracts and improved rules, market monitoring, etc., etc. Was it worth it? Many economists ask that. Was it worth deregulating the market or not? Well, it turns out that yes. I mean, if some economists look at, well, how did hit rates change of the machine? Did firms have incentives to operate or their machines more efficiently? Did they invest in more efficient portfolios? And there is empirical evidence that they did. Okay, over time it changed. There was pressure on the efficiency. The only problem is that the gains from deregulation did not necessarily benefit everyone the same way. So if you think of welfare as an economist, welfare is aggregate welfare, the aggregate happiness of all agents, but that welfare might be distributed very unevenly. So if I get everything and you get nothing, for an economist that's the same as if we all get what I get divided by the number of people here. It's the same. Okay? So in terms of equity, maybe it didn't work that well, but in terms of efficiency, it's working so far. Another question, so they say, okay, if we deregulated the generation segment, so markets now can provide generation. Can we trust markets to provide transmission investment? How about we copy the same idea and we let private firms to just invest in transmission? So the the idea of merchant transmission investments emerged. And what's the idea of a merchant transmission investment? Basically, each investor develops its own transmission infrastructure at its own risk. You build your line, there's no guarantee that you're going to cover your costs. It's like generation. And what's the business here? Basically, you build a new line, and you're like a transport company. You take energy from a cheap node and sell it at a more expensive node. And how much you make is the price difference times what you transport. That's it. Like any transport company. Okay. So in an ideal theoretical world, Bill Hogan, Jim Bushnell, and Steven Stoft proved that if everything is perfect, information, markets, everything, all profitable projects are efficient. That means that all projects where private investors make money are welcome. They improve the efficiency of the system. The problem is the second part, is that not all efficient projects are profitable. That means that not all the projects we want are necessarily profitable for private investors. So the market can provide us some lines, but we still need to do some central planning for the ones that are remaining. Okay? So the answer was like, no, you can't just rely on merchant transmission investment. And then Paul Josko and Jean Tirole, another Nobel Prize here, also proved that if you make more realistic assumptions about the market, so now the world is not perfect. There's perfect strategic behavior, market power, etc. Then merchant investors have incentives to undersize lines. Basically, it makes sense. Like if your business is the price differential, you don't have incentives to remove congestion. If you remove congestion in a line, the prices converge and your business disappears. That's the whole point of your business. But you never want to build too much transmission. Okay? And the problem is that in reality, most prices are actually distorted for different reasons. So whatever prices are seeing these transmission companies are already distorted, so they're not giving the right incentives anyway. So it's like, skeptical about this. In the actual world, actually there are very, very few examples of this merchant transmission line. Very few. And most transmission infrastructure is still centrally planned. So the regulation work for generation, for transmission, no. Okay. Centralized versus decentralized spot markets. This is another question. Okay, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but basically once you agree to have a market, firms plan their own generation, there are two ways to set up the markets. One way is to have a system operator that receives all the information from the firms. The operator receives all the information from demand, and the operator knows all the constraints of the system, does an economic dispatch program, and gives schedules for all firms. Okay? That's one way to. That's the centralized or pulco market. That's like the standard design in US electricity markets. That's how we normally think about the market. But there is also a decentralized version of that. Basically, there is a transmission operator, but generation firms and consumers trade bilaterally. And this design actually gives electrical engineers a lot of anxiety, because when they see it, they're like, oh my God, how does this work? Okay, how can just companies be trading bilaterally and the system doesn't collapse? Well, there's a system operator that has some small participation here that just tries to make the system feasible, but kind of like on the side. There's just a market for imbalances. Okay, but if you want to sell, I don't know how much power to a consumer on the other side of the country, and you make a trade, you just schedule your machines, and then almost like the rest of the system has to accommodate what you're doing. Okay, and it's really impressive how this still, works. Okay. And that's the common design of electricity markets in Europe, basically. Companies just trade bilaterally. Most engineers prefer centralized markets. Lots of economists prefer the second one. In terms of efficiency, the ranking is ambiguous. You can set out a model and say, look, if I assume this, the one on top wins. And then I can say, no, look, if I assume this, the second one wins. It's like, okay, so which one is better? Well, there is empirical evidence, this is not a model, this is empirical evidence, that actually centralized markets are more efficient. Anyone has any insight why one might be better than the other one? Oh, let me ask the other way. What's the downside of the decentralized market? That's the most obvious one.
Market power.
And both you can have market power. What do you think?
Supply failure? Supply failure? You don't mean demand.
Underinvestment? So I'm going to say again, in decentralized markets, it's like you don't have a system operator. Like the system operator comes almost at the end, like to fix things. Right.
If it cannot fix things, the system might go out. That doesn't.
Yeah, but there are not lots of.
I don't know.
I don't think there's much load shedding, for example, in Europe. Like the system still works. How does it work? Does it work efficiently, you think?
Or maybe you're doing.
Maybe you're not using the balance between available energy. Let me try to explain. Maybe you have more resource available in some period of years in one place that you could be using that to gain more efficiency in the whole year. Yeah. Yep, exactly.
Basically, think of this. The odds that companies are taking into account their effect on the other companies, like basically I send you power. And by doing that, there's no economic dispatch between it. I just committed to send you power because you're willing to pay for what I'm willing to send. That's it. I send you power. And by doing that, I also congest the system, right? That means that there are other companies that can trade less power because of me. It's very unlikely that the parties are going to take into account their externalities on the system. It's very unlikely that two firms trading bilaterally will take into account all the engineering constraints of the system. It's just hard to believe, right? And what do you think is the downside of the centralized market? That one takes into account everything. Like it's like the firms, the system operator asks firms to give the information about their costs, ask the demand to give parameters about forecasted demand, and just matches supply and demand, taking into account everything, all constraints. But there's a catch. What's the problem? What was the problem of central planning? Do you remember at the beginning? Huh? Preferences? Yeah, preference. It's kind of like lying. You are doing an optimization over reported information. You might be doing the right thing, but maybe firms are lying. Maybe firms are not reporting their true hit rates. Maybe they're not reporting their true ramping limits. Okay, so you're using a very advanced tool, right, to optimize, to give me a 0% optimality gap, the most efficient solution. But 50% of the companies lie to you. So those are not the hit rates, actually. Those are not the ramping limits. Okay, so you have a very efficient solution for the wrong problem. Yeah, that's Bob Wilson says. At some point, optimization becomes a fantasy. Like you go to sleep very, like, oh, I optimized this, but everyone lied to you. Like you're optimizing over a lie. Okay, that's the problem. So the one on top works very well if you have some efficient mechanism to extract the information. If not, it's a fantasy. Right? And the second one gives the parties more incentives to reveal information. If you want to learn more about the economics of information, many books about that. You can learn about what are the mechanisms to make people report their true preferences, or the truth, basically. Okay. So, centralized versus decentralized spot market. This is the example. So, these economists were very lucky because do you know the PGM market in the US? It's on the East Coast, Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, that area. They were very lucky because there was some point back in 2004-5 where there was an area of Ohio that still worked as a decentralized market with bilateral transactions. And one day they agreed to join PGM and to be part of a centralized market. So these economists were very lucky because they were there right for that time. So they were able to measure dispatch variables, prices, and everything before and after. Like the exact day it changed. And what they found was that there was a dramatic change in the dispatch of the system on the use of transmission resources. Way, way more efficient. So their conclusion was that taking into account constraints prime over the possible loss in efficiency by not using maybe the best information, maybe parties were lying, that effect was smaller than the gains from co-optimizing everything. That was their conclusion. Okay, it's very cool, empirical evidence that going to a centralized market work. This is kind of like going from a decentralized system of taxis and then Uber comes to the city. How does the system work? Same thing. How do we use the streets or the resources? It's the same analogy. Okay?
One question. Does this market have, I don't know, external regulation that says that if a firm is discovered to be lying to the central planner, they get some penalties?
All markets in the US have market monitoring departments.
Which is essentially a mechanism to incentivize people not lying.
Yeah, so two things. If they catch you exercising market power, you face a huge penalty by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But they need to catch you first thing. Second, they have market monitoring departments. And in those departments, they have preventive tests and behavioral tests. A behavioral test is basically big data. They have a database where they know how companies have been bidding over time, like every hour of the day, during the weekend, during the night. And if at some point you change your pattern, like strangely, some light's gonna come on, and they're gonna be like, "Hey, what are you doing there?" It's kind of like when your credit card gets stolen. You know, my credit card has gotten stolen twice, or cloned. And I asked the bank, how do you know that I wasn't buying stuff in the US? Like I go to the US the whole time. How do you know that was stolen? Like someone drawing me and not me buying something. They were like, well, this deviates from your normal behavior. Same thing. If you deviate from normal behavior, someone starts looking very closely at your data. They might let you do it there, but the next month, the Federal Energy Commission will come and knock at your door and be like, "Hey, we need to talk to you." One thing. The other thing is that they have a structural test. Basically, they say, "Okay, you are the only firm in this point, this node, and there's demand here." Say, for example, Rio de Janeiro. There's only one substation here, and you're the only firm here. And in this hour, the 3 lines that get to Rio de Janeiro are congested. So if you want to charge $1 million per megawatt hour, you can't, because there is no one else to supply demand. They can detect those basically times or places where that happened, and they prevent you from making an offer. They say, "I'm sorry, buddy, we are going to define an administrative price for you. You're not going to bid. We know that your costs are approximately this, and that's what's going to go into the software. We're not going to get input from you. We're not going to ask you what's your cost. This is your cost. Sorry. If you lose money, I'm sorry. It's just an administrative fix for market problem." Okay? So structural test, behavioral test, and then the law. There's an economist in Berkeley that she discovered that in general, market power, firms exercise less market power than what they could because of, I know the word Spanish, I don't know if it's in English word, the regulation has a maybe dissuasive role. Basically, the fact that there's like a police there looking at you makes you drive a little bit slower. Even if it doesn't give you a ticket, just the fact that you know that there's a police there, you behave differently. And she believes that just the fact that there's a watchdog makes firms change their behavior. So that's important because if you run a model with imperfect competition, the model is not going to care about it. It's going to say, you do this. You're going to explode the market. But then you look at the real data and it's like, hey, firms are not doing this. They're actually behaving better. And it has a lot to do with it. Okay. Hot questions today. So these are possible research topics. Can, for example, scarcity pricing provide sufficient signals to ensure resource adequacy? Basically, can we just let the prices spike to $1 million and that will just incentivize the generation we need? Or we need something else on the side to help generators build capacity, the capacity we want, basically. Can current markets remunerate flexible resources efficiently? Our current, is the current granularity in our prices giving the right incentives to flexible resources to be there? Maybe not. Do markets require administrative fix, like the flexi ramp in California? California has a market, but they take more of a central planner approach to fix things. They say, hey, we had such a bad experience with the California crisis that we're just going to do a little bit of central planning. Whatever. If we do it wrong, whatever. Okay? So they have a product that is called Flexi Ramp. They basically, it's like a reserve product where they pay units that can ramp up very quickly to the next hours, and you get paid for being available to ramp. Right? So the only firms, or the only units that can participate in that market are the ones that can run that fast. Basically, a slow unit cannot offer into the market because it's not that fast. The demand for that product is determined basically by the ISO. The ISO just has an estimate of how good or bad is their solar wind forecast, and they say, okay, the next hours, we believe that it's going to be a huge ramp. We need to have units able to ramp very quickly just in case. So they just create that demand, and if you have a Ferrari that can do that, you get paid. Okay. Is that the best way to remunerate flexibility? Maybe not. I don't know, but it's working. Okay, it's an administrative solution. Are there no market signals to ensure efficient investments in energy storage? We're working on this question in Chile. So there's so many studies that say storage is wonderful, right? You can integrate renewables better. They can provide reserve products. You can defer generation investments. You can defer transmission investment. It's like you can cure cancer with energy storage. You can do everything. But then we look at markets and we don't see private investors investing in storage. What's going on? And the question is, well, maybe there are not market signals to do it, right? It's like if you do central planning, if you run your central planning model, and you make storage available, that model says, yeah, I want all this storage. But then if you solve the same problem as an equilibrium, storage doesn't show up. Why not? Maybe there's a problem with the prices. You're not remunerating flexibility in the right way. You're not letting prices, vary what they have to do. Maybe you have some average price that doesn't let the storage unit see the value, right, of charging now and discharging later. If that signal is not there, you should not expect to see investment. What are we missing from not having widespread demand response program? Again, tons of papers that said demand response is so valuable. Well, why are we not seeing it? Is it a problem with our current market design? Or is it a problem that even if we give consumers the prices, maybe they don't care. They just don't care about varying prices. They won't respond. Is that a problem of does that problem have more to do with psychology or with our market design problem? Okay. And cool programs with differentiated reliability levels replace administrative constraints to ensure reliability. If you think about the economic dispatch problem as an equilibrium problem, you have supply-demand balance, right? There's a dual variable there, there's a price. But there are other constraints too for demand. For example, we want demand for reserves, right? We have reliability. We have installed reserve constraints. We want to have at least 10% more installed capacity than the peak demand of our system. Those are artificial demand parameters. Like, it's not like the consumers are expressing that demand. It's the operator that's saying, we just want to ensure that this works. It's fine, you know? But the problem is that can you replace that with, say, maybe different products, different plans, if you wish, for electricity? Like the way you choose your cell phone plan. Maybe if an electricity company offers you a very reliable plan and an unreliable plan that is cheap, you'll say, sure, I'll have my reliable plan at home. I don't want, you know, the lights to go out. But if I have a house in the beach that I go once a month, I don't care if you cut the lights there, you know? Right? If you give that information to the operator, that there are lots of clients that are willing to disconnect their demand as long as they get paid for it, that will reduce the demand for reserves significantly, right? Today, demand is treated as a parameter. It's this vertical demand curve that you can't violate. But maybe it's not like that. So, and market design, again, has a lot to do with renewables. It's a very interesting report from the International Renewable Energy Agency, and it's all about adapting market design to high shares of renewable energy. And their statement is basically, all the markets we have today were designed thinking on the old set of technologies we have. We had coal, gas, hydro. And they have worked well for many years. But now, the technologies we have today, the hardware, is very different from what we had before. So it's very likely that we're going to have to change the software. The software that runs in your new iPhone is not the same software that runs in your first iPhone, I bet. Okay? And it's the software that lets you use the iPhone the way you use it. Like, that lets you explode, basically take advantage of everything that your iPhone can do. And with markets, with electricity markets, it's the same. You have to create markets that enable you to take advantage of the resources you have. Otherwise, you won't be able to. This same thing. Electricity market design from the Renewable Energy Technology Development Agency, International Energy Agency here. They say, yeah, we need to redesign markets. The problem is that the new technologies are very expensive in terms of capital costs, but then they have almost zero marginal cost. What's going to happen with prices in the future? How are firms going to recover their investment if there's nothing to make in the spot market? Are we going to have to create different products? They have limited variability and predictability, and now there's lots of decentralized and scattered generation. People are starting to install solar panels and storage units in their homes. Some people are starting to buy electric cars. How are we going to control all of these things? Are we expecting the system operator to include the charging variable of every single car in the country? Or are we going to use some decentralized solution? Are we just going to give people prices and they're going to decide what they want to do? Are we going to be like the Uber, basically, of the electricity market? All right, that's it. Let's first section.